Why we won't be moving to St. Petersburg, Florida. On today's video, we're going to be exploring the city of St. Petersburg and talking about why it isn't an option for us when we're ready to move. This is Maximo Park. It is on the southern tip of St. Petersburg. It's named after Antonio Maximo Hernandez, thought to be the first white settler on the peninsula. He was a fisherman, a businessman, and a local guide. He was given a large land grant by Robert E. Lee after assisting him. And like many places in southwest Florida, St. Petersburg was initially founded by Cuban American families. However, today St. Petersburg is one of the least Hispanic large cities in Florida. Today, Central Avenue acts as the main street of St. Petersburg, and it also segregates the city, with most of the black population living in the south side of the city. In my opinion, South St. Petersburg is one of the most beautiful African American districts in the United States, with original cobblestone streets, royal Cuban palm trees, and beautiful historic homes. One of Ray Charles' first recordings was the St. Petersburg Blues. Because of the famous song Georgia on My Mind, many people believe that Ray Charles is mostly connected with Georgia. However, his roots were deeply embedded in Florida as well. It is possible that his song The St. Petersburg Blues would have been his first recording ever. However, he had yet to develop his voice, and thus it could have been a very primitive recording, not up to the standard that he later became known for. But for many of the people in St. Petersburg, Florida, Ray Charles' first song would have been for their city. And in a time of Jim Crow laws and segregation at its peak, many whites from St. Petersburg would go to African American communities to hear Ray Charles. The Manhattan Casino on 22nd is a place where many of the greatest talents of African American singers would come to play, and this was also the place where many of the white people from St. Petersburg would cross the racial line and enjoy the talents of African Americans in a time where doing just a thing would have probably been seriously frowned upon. Historically, St. Petersburg has a very deep, rich culture. However, as of recently, the city has become somewhat of a pale reflection of what it once was. In some ways today, St. Petersburg is seriously lacking culturally in what many other Florida cities are abundant in it. The landscape of the city is beautiful. It's clean. There's a lot of great investments coming in. Some of the tallest residential buildings on the west coast of Florida are coming into St. Petersburg. The city aesthetically looks incredible. And in fact, it's probably one of the nicest, largest cities in Florida right now when it comes to the aesthetics of the city. It looks beautiful, charming, clean, and extraordinarily safe. Many years ago, St. Petersburg would have ranked among the most dangerous large cities in Florida. Today, it is easily the safest. Noticeably safer than Tampa, Orlando, Miami, and Jacksonville, you would think that this itself would be enough to make St. Pete the most attractive location to live in Florida. Regardless of how clean and safe the city may be, it still seems to be missing something. Miami has Latin flavor, fun nightlife, an incredible skyline, and its world-famous beaches. However, what is St. Petersburg known for? As of now, it's just a great place to vacation in Snowbird, a city with a large downtown with a lot of restaurants and things to do. But the city doesn't have any really denotable thing that makes it unique culturally, and this is where you start to draw a distinction culturally between cities like Orlando, Miami, and Jacksonville that have their own unique profile of culture to St. Petersburg, a city that really doesn't have it. Even Tampa next door has its own identity. It's known for a Cuban sandwich scene, for example. There's a large Colombian community with their Colombian restaurants, music, bars, and nightlife. Its historic Ybor district with its bars and nightlife. Tampa has a strong cultural presence. But when you compare it to St. Petersburg seems dull in comparison. Really, all of Florida's larger cities have developed their own identity and cultural mark, while St. Petersburg simply hasn't done that. So while St. Petersburg has become a great, safe, clean city that many people enjoy going to, it just hasn't left a cultural stamp. And for any Florida city with as much infusion of culture as this state has, that is a definite downside. There are thousands of downtown restaurants and places to eat. Unfortunately, most of them are just nothing more than the grub of millennials and hipsters. Everything seems to be pale, lacking authenticity, and we've yet to find a single place in St. Petersburg that we can say this place is authentic. The city is simply lacking when it comes to culture. Even Orlando, a somewhat newer city in its growth, has been able to infuse a lot of the Puerto Rican food into its local culture and has grown, and as it's grown, it's soaked in cultures and created its own identity. Now, Orlando is a fairly fake and plastic city compared to Tampa and Miami, which are more original, but even Orlando has somewhat of an identity when it comes to cuisine and culture. St. Petersburg simply doesn't have any notable features. Even newer cities like Cape Coral, which are recently growing fast suburban sprawls, have some type of distinctive feature about its identity. But like I said, St. Petersburg simply doesn't have any of that. Interestingly enough, St. Petersburg is actually one of the larger city cores. Being an older city, it's also landlocked at the bottom of Tampa Bay. St. Petersburg has nowhere to grow but up. And in fact, it's one of the recent growing skylines in Florida, as the only place this area can grow is up. Surrounding St. Petersburg are no sprawling suburbs. It is in the middle of a large urban complex, which means that suburbia hasn't been able to stretch its tentacles into St. Petersburg or affect its culture, which is an even more puzzling question mark about why St. Petersburg doesn't have its own cultural identity. I mean, if you think about it, just the notion that St. Petersburg is in its core the same city it was many decades ago, unaffected by growth and development, that in itself would kind of suggest that St. Petersburg should have more going on culturally than other Florida cities. Really, it's almost hard to understand why St. Petersburg is just a bland city, despite the fact it's next to Tampa, despite the fact it's in Florida with its cultural infusions, and despite the fact that it's near the beaches, making it a perfect place for people to snowboard and vacation. All these great things going for St. Petersburg, and it is nothing more than one of the most bland, hipster-ridden cities in Florida. St. Petersburg is easily one of the most liberal cities in Florida, with only Fort Lauderdale being in competition. But Fort Lauderdale is also a city infused with culture. How on earth is St. Petersburg so bland when it shares common attributes of other places that would suggest it would be the complete opposite? Other than its African American community south of Central, when you look at Pinellas County, you'll notice that it is the largest conglomeration of white people anywhere in the state of Florida. I mean, literally the entire peninsula is almost entirely white. It is the least diverse place in Florida, at least among large urban cores. But even that doesn't answer the question, because other areas like Tampa, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm Beach also have large white urban cores, and they still have cultural identities. I mean, just take the food scene in Jacksonville, a city that is demographically somewhat more similar to St. Petersburg. It has its own freaking food culture. It has its own identity, despite being ethnically similar in composition to St. Petersburg. Even then, hipster food is also, as we all know, somewhat considerably more expensive than other cuisines, which means that not only does food suck in St. Petersburg, but it's also considerably more expensive, since you're paying for the ambiance and the atmosphere of the location versus the actual authenticity of the food. An apartment in downtown St. Petersburg, a small one at that, will start you off at around $3,000. Now, one of the beautiful things about doing food delivery is that it puts you inside of very interesting places. While doing food delivery in St. Petersburg, I was able to go inside a few of these high-rise buildings in downtown and deliver food to people living inside of these downtown apartment complex that are labeled luxury living. When you open up the elevator doors, the overwhelming smell of greenery is very present. See, despite the fact that St. Petersburg is criminally one of the safest cities in Florida, it also has the highest overdose death rate of anywhere in the state, at least among its urban cores. So while St. Petersburg is a safe city from the perspective of violent crime, it's also a pretty horrible place when it comes to addiction lifestyles. For example, the overdose death rate for Pinellas County is about 5 times higher than Dade County, which is where Miami sits, and it's almost 1/3 higher than Hillsborough County, where Tampa sits. There's no nice way of saying it. One of the positive things about St. Petersburg is that it has a low violent crime rate, but one of the negative things you could say is that addiction is fairly prevalent here. And while driving through the city or while going inside buildings, you'll notice the smell everywhere, a smell that I personally dislike. I think it makes any place seem fairly trashy. So while the people of St. Petersburg have a very clean, beautiful, and safe city, it also has a serious addiction or consumption problem depending on how you look at it. It's hard to talk about St. Petersburg and not talk about how left-leaning this city is. For most people in this city, it's practically legal. But remember, you are still in the state of Florida where it is technically illegal. And one of the craziest things about St. Petersburg is seeing how people, well, even have businesses of this nature, even though it's technically illegal on a state level, but the people here just look at it as a normal thing. The events that the city hosts are also going to be liberal leaning. In other words, if this isn't your cup of tea, you probably won't enjoy living in a city that is this left leaning. Now, technically, the average age of individuals in St. Petersburg, Florida is higher than the state average. The issue is that you would probably never be able to tell. Downtown St. Petersburg feels like one of the youngest cities in Florida. In fact, it feels like a Gainesville or Tallahassee, a city with nothing but young people. But you can't forget that within the city limits of St. Petersburg, pushing towards the water, you have a lot of retirement communities. So it's somewhat of a city that has two completely different age demographics. The downtown area and the hip districts really make St. Petersburg feel like one of the youngest cities in Florida. But when you take in the entirety of the city limits of St. Petersburg, it actually averages out to be older than average for the rest of the state. Very confusing. You can almost look at St. Petersburg as having the body of a young person, but the soul of an old person. A very old person. I know a lot of you guys like to just assume that the black part of a city is always the worst part of a city, but to be fair, there are downsides to both sides. The further north you go into St. Petersburg, the whiter it gets. You have problems with that demographic. The consumption isn't the only problem. If you go far enough in the north, you'll end up in an area known as Pinellas Park, which has one of the highest percentages of registered offenders of anywhere in the state of Florida. And if you go further south into the black neighborhoods, you have a higher violent crime rate. Interestingly enough, if you're looking for a newer apartment in some of the highest crime rate areas in the southern part of the city, you're still going to be paying more to live there than you would in Wesley Chapel or Lakewood Ranch, some of the best suburbs in the Tampa area. In other words, even though you're living in a somewhat crime-ridden part of St. Petersburg, you're still paying an arm and a leg for rent. And overall, St. Petersburg is a nice, beautiful, and safe city. That's undeniable, but any city is going to have some pretty crappy spots. And in the case of St. Petersburg, that spot is somewhere along Central To just lightly touch on this subject, you can see a young lady here walking on a sidewalk late at night wearing very little clothes, and some homeless people hanging out here in the background. While driving around this empty parking lot, we startled a homeless guy who was sleeping, who instantly jumped up from his sleep, letting us know that he was awake instantly. He seemed to be somewhat paranoid. Earlier in the day, we noticed this homeless guy right here in front of what looks like a Jamaican restaurant. Now, I'm not sure exactly what he was doing, but it was definitely an interesting thing to see. And well, with Pinellas County having just a high overdose death rate, it's no surprise that there's people in this city who are stoned out of their minds, and you'll see some interesting scenarios while driving around the city on a daily basis, and that can kind of get old fairly quickly. Now, to be fair, you're not going to see that in the nicer neighborhoods, but if you venture off into some of the most abandoned neighborhoods of the city, you're probably going to encounter yourself seeing, some pretty interesting scenarios. One of the great things about St. Petersburg that I have to notice is how people here seem fairly healthy and active. People are always walking, they're always exercising. It kind of reminds me of Canada, where people are just really into looking good, staying healthy, and perhaps that's why the food scene here sucks. Walking through downtown at night, homelessness is noticeable, but it isn't as bad as in other places. I mean, to be fair, it's a problem that every American city is facing, and it isn't fair to point a finger at St. Petersburg and say things are horrible here when it's kind of a problem everywhere at this point. But noticeably, it's still better than Orlando by far. Sadly, Miami has more homelessness than St. Petersburg these days. It used to not be like that, but it's starting to be like that. At least in the downtown area, homelessness doesn't seem to be that much of a problem. I even ventured into a park that supposedly had a lot of homeless people. I noticed that they turn on the sprinklers at night heavily, probably to keep the homeless people from going there. Overall, I can say that it feels like homelessness feels pretty contained when it comes to St. Petersburg, but I did notice that there was almost no law enforcement presence anywhere near the downtown district, and it seems like Miami has the same scenario going on. I really don't understand why a city this large with just an active downtown doesn't have a visible law enforcement presence. I'm not going to tell you my reason why I believe. Let's discuss this in the comment section. There's an old saying that says great minds think alike. I want to see what you guys think about why St. Petersburg doesn't have a visible police presence in downtown, despite the fact, judging by the size of the city, it practically should. I mean, compare it to Sarasota next door, right? You've seen my Sarasota videos. There's usually 5, 6, 7, or 8 police cars in downtown Sarasota. In the case of St. Petersburg, I don't think I saw a single police car in downtown. I did notice, however, that in some of the poorer neighborhoods, not only do you see police officers out and about, but they almost seem to be like patrolling aggressively. At least that's the vibe that I got in some of the poorer neighborhoods in the city. Could it be that the city's police force is stretched thin, or that they don't need to be in downtown because there aren't any unfolding issues? I'm not really sure why, but it would make sense for a busy downtown to have police officers present. Maybe I'm wrong. Let me hear your thoughts on that. I guess this would only really be a concerning matter if the city had a huge crime problem, which it doesn't. Like I've kind of emphasized a few times today, it's actually much safer than Orlando, Tampa, Jacksonville, Miami. Just most of the large cities in Florida have a considerably more serious crime problem than St. Petersburg. And it used to not be that way many years ago. It's really transformed into a much better and nicer city. As you guys know, I have always emphasized on this YouTube channel the importance of safety. If your city doesn't have safety, nothing else that it has matters. The number one and prime thing that any city needs to have to be great is safety. So with that being said, why wouldn't I move to St. Petersburg? If after all, it does have a good vibe, it's chill, it's relaxed, it has access to beaches and other natural things to do, it's extraordinarily safe, why a no on St. Petersburg? Nothing will ruin your ability to enjoy a city like that city being dangerous. So if you personally are considering St. Petersburg, I'm not going to discourage you. Sarasota, for a similar price tag, has beaches that are closer, free parking at the beaches, not a single toll road that I can think of anywhere in the Sarasota area. You'll get tolls in St. Petersburg, especially if you're going to the beaches. And while there are plenty of free beach areas in St. Petersburg, the ones you're going to go to, you're going to have to pay for them. And that doesn't exist anywhere in the Sarasota area. In Sarasota, beach parking and access is free. In St. Petersburg, you're probably going to have to pay for it. Sadly, Tampa Bay is extraordinarily contaminated. It used to be that Tampa Bay had some of the clearest water in Florida. I mean, thus the name Clearwater Beach. Unfortunately, the hurricanes, the contamination, and well, really the mismanagement of the waterways in Florida, situations like Piney Point, recent hurricanes, and just the disregard and respect and dignity that the water deserves hasn't been present in Tampa Bay as a whole. This means that when you look at the water quality, it is disgusting what's happening in Tampa Bay. Sarasota, for example, and Fort Myers Beach are more open areas, which means the water has better circulation and the water isn't as contaminated. Tampa Bay is kind of waterlocked. The water has nowhere to go. The contamination is stagnant. The water just looks nasty. The condition of contamination in Tampa Bay has got so bad that it's starting to make a noticeable difference in the water quality. While enjoying beaches, parks, and other natural areas, you may notice a foul smell coming from the water. Now, while the red tide affects most of Florida evenly, at least on the southwest coast, there's something particular about Tampa Bay where the contamination is just a ever-present sludge in the waterways. Sure, you have the algae blooms and the red tide and all that stuff, but actual contamination in the water, Tampa Bay has become a stagnant crap hole of water that is just nasty. You'll notice it. I was even out of breath most of the time when I was up in St. Petersburg. You may have noticed in my St. Petersburg videos, I was literally out of breath. And well, sadly, the contamination is that bad. On our last few visits, we've done activities near the water. You'll see dead fish. It just stinks. There's no other way around it. St. Petersburg is surrounded by a lot of contamination. Those hurricanes did a lot of damage, and it isn't just the hurricanes. It's just the fact that there's too many environmentally sensitive areas here that haven't been respected and cared for adequately. Here in the Sarasota and Bradenton area, we got hit directly by those hurricanes, and the water quality was bad for a while, but it's finally starting to clean up to a degree. In the Tampa Bay area, it's not getting better. In fact, I feel like the more time passes, the worse the contamination issue is becoming for this area. And what makes Florida great is the water. If the water is sick, dying, stinky, and sludgy, so are the cities around it. Now, St. Petersburg, on the peninsula that it sits in with Pinellas County, is an urban core, an established older urban core. There's a lot of places where the water here simply can't circulate. Tampa Bay is, after all, the largest bay in Florida, facing the Gulf side with hot water temperature, very little circulation. One would assume that this area, being completely developed with very few natural areas left, like mangroves and estuaries and stuff like that, would eventually, with urbanization and contamination, become a nightmare of an ecological disaster, and that's kind of what's happening right now. The real issue with St. Petersburg is that it's an older city and most of the housing here is older. If you want to live in new construction in St. Petersburg, Florida, you're going to pay a premium. On top of that, it just doesn't seem like the beaches and waterways here are as healthy as in other parts of the state where you can enjoy more pristine beaches. Overall, St. Petersburg isn't a horrible place, but for my personal needs, I feel like the price tag that comes with living in St. Petersburg doesn't reflect what you get in return. Today, living in any of the larger cities in Florida has a considerable price tag, comparable at that. In the case of St. Petersburg, it offers increased safety over these other cities. So if you're looking for peaceful, tranquil living, St. Petersburg would be a great option. But as a YouTuber like myself, there's not a lot of money to be made with, well, the lack of activity. It's actually the activities that make a city more interesting. And when it comes to St. Petersburg, it's fairly uneventful, which wouldn't make an attractive place for me as a YouTuber to live in a place that's kind of, well, run-of-the-mill, safe, quiet, and calm. So while I wouldn't discourage you from living in St. Petersburg, it's probably one of the best options in Florida, but for me, it's just too far to the left, and that comes with a whole package of having to smell herb everywhere you go. I don't really like to talk bad about other people's lifestyles because I'm not financing them, but it isn't my cup of tea. And while I have a tolerance for other people's lifestyles that differ from mine, I don't want to live in a place that seems to just cater to a lifestyle that isn't the one I'm living. So I say that respectfully. It just isn't my personal cup of tea. When a city's events, lifestyles, and even the smell of the city reflect people's lifestyles and it's kind of infused into everything you do in the city, and that isn't something you're into, it starts to seem less and less appealing to live in a place that doesn't really match your values. St. Petersburg is practically a West Coast vibe city on the East Coast. But of course, as we know, West Coast cities have high incomes, and well, St. Petersburg, being vastly a city revolving around tourism and residential areas, doesn't have the most excelling opportunities, which means that most people who live in St. Petersburg and want to have an excelling opportunity simply aren't going to find it here. You may find a social group that you like, you may find comfortable settings, but you're not going to find incredible opportunities in St. Petersburg. When it comes to incomes, Pinellas County is the 24th highest in Florida. Counties like Sarasota and Manatee, the metro area where I currently live, have less rent costs but higher incomes. So if you're renting, there's not a lot of bang for your buck. If you like to live in a fast-growing, opportunity-driven type of place, it's a landlocked area. There's nowhere for St. Petersburg to grow. It's kind of stagnant in a lot of ways because it doesn't have the ability to grow. It's surrounded by a metropolitan area. The only way St. Petersburg can grow is up, which means that the cost per square footage is going to be higher. The chances of availability of housing entering the market supply is fairly limited, but the potential for more people to want to live here, appreciation because of being near the water, is always going to exist, which means that there is no alleviation of rental costs in Pinellas County. Of those 23 counties that have higher incomes, only 5 of them have higher costs of renting. That means that there are probably 4 or 5 other places you can move to where you can have a better standard of living and have probably about comparable income so you can pull it off, which this makes, again, St. Petersburg fairly unattractive. If you're already in the top tier of rental prices, you might as well go for the Browards, the Corliers, the places that, like the cost of living would correlate with the incomes and other things to live in. So yes, it is among the top 5 players in Florida. Yes, it is the safest among the top 5 players in Florida as far as large metro areas go. But then when you look at income versus housing costs, it comes out at a disadvantage. Basically, whoever's looking at St. Petersburg, Florida, is also looking at middle-sized cities. People who are looking for large cities are probably going to look for large cities that offer other things. The problem with St. Petersburg is that it offers what a medium-sized city would have, but with a large city package, and that's not a model everybody's trying to fit. For a large city, St. Petersburg is fairly safe, but when you compare it to the rest of Florida, among those counties that have higher income are also 13 other counties that are safer with higher incomes. And just about every single one of them, with a few exceptions like Corlier, are going to have, better cost of living. housing costs. Therefore, this makes St. Petersburg logistically a very impossible top option for anyone other than a young person who wants to be around other young people in a large city but not have to deal with large city problems like crime. It's like an Aston Martin Signet. It's just a lot of money to pay because of a name brand, but then there's nothing else to go along with it. I mean, it's not like the other cities because it's safer, but then again, it also isn't like the other cities because it doesn't have any like culture or identity. And look, if you live in St. Petersburg, you can be proud of your city. Like I said, it's a larger city that's safe. None of the other cities in Florida can brag about that. So there's definitely a lot to be proud of here. But from the perspective of somebody's moving, they're usually going to be looking for something. And what is the something that St. Petersburg has to offer other than a large city? Most people who are considering cities are kind of understanding the notion that it's going to come with crime. Now, cities in Florida like Miami, Orlando, and Tampa have a lot of crime, but it's nothing compared to other large cities in other regions of the country. So most people relocating to Florida are already going to get an improvement if they're moving to a large city when you talk about crime. I mean, literally every other city on the East Coast is going to have higher crime rates than any other state. So the people that are relocating here are already getting safety. Most people are going to be content with a considerable improvement in safety and are not going to want to refine that any further more. And that is why St. Petersburg, Florida wouldn't be an option for me and my wife, Katie, as we consider relocating somewhere else. It's just a city that for the price tag has very little to offer. I mean, safety, good, but then there's places, if you're going for safety, there's still better options. So it's like, it's good at a lot of things, but it's not the best at anything, and that kind of makes it kind of a mediocre option. So that's St. Petersburg, Florida, a great, beautiful city. And like I've said before, I'm not trying to discourage you from moving there, but it certainly doesn't really strike any of the chords for me other than safety for a large city. So there it is, St. Petersburg, Florida, probably not going to happen. I'm not angry or upset at St. Petersburg like I was with Orlando and huge disappointment. It's nothing of that sort. But just pure math, it doesn't really check off completely. And I have to add, despite the fact that there are a lot of young people in downtown St. Petersburg, and that's kind of what's going on in downtown St. Petersburg, it doesn't seem like it's an easy place to make friends. It seems like a lot of people here are kind of loners, and well, part of wanting to be in a city is interacting with other people, and St. Petersburg doesn't seem like people like to interact with people that much. And when they do it, they're decent and pleasant. It's not like they're a nasty city, but, it just isn't one thing or the other. It's just kind of like stuck in the middle in every single category. It doesn't really denote itself in a positive way for anything. It just kind of rides the middle. And I think most people in Florida kind of want something of substance when they consider moving somewhere, and that includes us.